Recording in progress.
Hello and welcome, Parallel Perception Community. We are on our second video that is doing a deep dive into the power of emptiness. So today, what we wanted to go over were a few of the chapters dominated by the Mango Grove Master. And the other chapters that are included will be the Immature Seed, Patiently Waiting, Abundance, and My Teacher. And for those of you following along, yes, the I Am Mountain, I Am is in the middle, but we're going to take care of that next time. So these are the ones that we want to go over today. Okay, so.
Oh, by the way, Angel, I really appreciate you. That's all I've got to say. You're such a beautiful person. Yeah.
So what I did first, because I like that, is to research why the mango tree. And I looked up some other things around mango tree parables, et cetera, et cetera. But these are a couple of the highlights that I really enjoyed listening to it. So spiritually, Hindus regard mangoes as the king of fruit and a symbol of prosperity and happiness, which is why it's used one way or another in all rituals in the Hinduism, among other religions. Now, Buddha, who taught primarily in northeastern India, was gifted a mango grove in 500 BCE as a place for meditation, and the fruit is a symbol of love in the Vedic mythology. One of the things I looked up was really fascinating. Is it said Bible scholars say that because of the temperate climate where the Garden of Eden was supposed to be, that it could not have been an apple. It would have had to have been either a mango or a pomegranate. So I thought that was interesting. And
I think mango's much more tempting than a pomegranate.
I think. And then this is going to come up later again, and we're going to explore that some more. But in my research, I found that every part of the mango is beneficial and has been utilized in folk remedies in some form or another, whether it's the bark, the leaves, the skin, or the pit. All have concocted into various types of treatments, preventatives, down throughout the centuries. So I thought that was interesting because I first wanted to know why a mango tree.
Have you ever really had a look at a mango? It looks like the shape of a heart.
You know, it sure does. It's kind of weighted weirdly on one side. That is beautiful. So what I wanted to do is, for those who maybe haven't remembered the entire story, is give a quick couple of sentence synopsis on the story, and then we're going to progress through it. Is that all right?
Okay. That's fine.
So 9 disciples in their 9th year tend to 9 mango saplings for 11 years. So the Mango Grove Master takes them in to glean and give and pass on his wisdom to the next generation. And it's going to teach various lessons throughout this. So I thought that was interesting. So let's start at the beginning with the Mango Grove Master receiving the boys, the saplings, and getting ready to plant them, and the foresight of setting aside one tree that would be used for an example. I want to talk about the care with the fertilization, because that was very interesting in terms of the detriments to overstimulation and over fertilizing while you were initially planting it. So can you expand on that?
Well, if you do too much too quickly, then it'll burn your roots and you won't be able to go deep. So you go very, very gently, slowly, you know, like they say in Asia, gently catch a monkey. It's slowly you creep up on somebody slowly to bring about their original nature, something that they've done previously, so it can be awoken in this lifetime. So when you gently prompt, you begin to see someone's original personality come to the surface, but it has to be done very, very carefully. And as soon as somebody gets to the heart, the unfolding of their predetermined nature is revealed. through heartfelt communication. That's when you truly find out who the person was previously in comparison to who they're really meant to be in the mayhem and the confusion of the world that's presenting itself to us at the moment.
Thank you. Now, I found it very interesting and somewhat counterintuitive and disturbing in my limited understanding. When you got to the first fruiting and made a decision to isolate one of the 9 trees and say, no, we're gonna allow you to bud, but we're gonna snip the others. That would seem like you were almost elevating that one, not penalizing it by cutting the buds. It seemed that for that first tree, that was of nature. Just go ahead and bud, do what comes naturally. But I found out that if you let it bud, sometimes it's just not good.
Well, you look at it from the perspective of someone who's the production of the whole life is promoted by the hormonal process, which way too much energy. And that energy is connected to heart consciousness, very, very sure. Because if you ask someone not to love another teenager or another young person, they'll say, and you say, well, you're not mature enough to understand what you're doing. But really, if you go back to your own memory, you'll discover that the love and the affection that you find for the first person you fall in love with is exquisite and very, very hard to discover or to find this love ever again in your life. And because the hormones are so high, or the feeling of communion is so complete, that when a young person says you don't understand, probably in a lot of cases, the adults really don't understand what they've gone through because maybe they've never experienced this intensity, or the intensity of their experience has been buried within guilting. So it's yeah, I think that's about it. I remember. Sorry about that, Angel. But I remember the first time. I remember the first time I fell in love, and it was very, very intense. It was highly devotional, but I was an outsider in my own community, really, and nobody ever knew the intense feelings that I had for everybody, actually, in the intense intuitive mechanisms that were occurring inside of me. It was very, very easy to tip the scales of the delicate foundations of my personality because I was receiving so much information from everybody, and I wanted to give my heart to everything, and the purity of my communication only came from this, as far as I was concerned. It was very easy to step on. So I was born in a Western community, obviously, because I'm a Western person, and it's very, very difficult for them to realize where I'd come from, who I was meant to become and arrive upon. It was very, very difficult. So they were the first obstacles, but they were the most beneficial obstacles of my life, not to be seen, and to fight for my right to actually dedicate my truth to every circumstance which evolved in front of me.
So you said not to be seen. How did not being seen avail you to the opportunity? What do you mean by that? I mean, because you were in a big community that wasn't necessarily your own. Is it because you were an outsider that you were not seen?
I was an outsider automatically because I exchanged in my form of communication was exchanging feeling in terms of how I could discuss what I was feeling and seeing in terms of what was going on in the environment, which seemed to be not available to anybody. As far as I could see, nobody could really see what was really going on. The pre-programming was so strong, and the elements of their communication were so harsh, so harshly direct that they could never go beyond their self-righteousness in terms of what they believed was really true. And it was very, very like I believe probably now over the last 5 years I've seen people putting down their defensive mechanisms to discover that there's something else hidden behind who they've been taught to be, and this is truly beautiful in terms of the people who really want to exchange and change the prospect of their future in terms of elevating their consciousness is now at hand, really.
I like that, because that
Yeah.
putting down and letting go of that pre-programming that's blocking receipt was kind of what I was trying to get at when saying drop the religious dogma, because they're
Yeah.
so heavily attached to that it prevents more from coming in.
But it's not only religious dogma, it's actually social edifice is a dogma as well. Believing they have the right to say this, believing they have the right to do that, believing they have the right to think this way. All the things that are meant to be contained, not rigidly, but to know that your words have to sustain the beauty of your heart. Your thoughts have to, if you do have thoughts, they have to reflect an integrity which doesn't affect or damage your own heart, and actions which are known by you but maybe cannot be seen by somebody else. It's very, very important that your actions do not you don't have anything that is counter in comparison to who you really are. So pure words, if you have thoughts, then pure thoughts, pure actions, and not to betray your own feelings of realization, so that you can walk a path which is diligently observant in terms of what you're meant to realize. Otherwise, life is wasted.
I like that. I'm still chewing on a few things. So we talked about basically the pruning, the first fruiting, and to prune or not to prune. And because if the mango group was left to grow wild, it would not be pruned. The addition of implementing that.
Now, when you grow mangoes, if you prune them, you actually make the tree stronger, the fruit more sweet. If you delay its capacity to manifest, it's just like a human being. If you delay yourself from manifesting before you know completely what you really need to do, who you really are meant to be, you do this like you do. I do this still all my life. I'm still pruning my capacity to deliver information to the circumstances, and I'm always watching what I'm saying or receiving, and then mirroring back. I'm always very, very careful to put the most strength, but an absolute tenderness within that strength. But even so, people sometimes find it difficult. Sometimes find it hard to face themselves. But if you really look at it, if you have a notion that is incorrect and you follow that notion that's incorrect, you will flower and bud within that incorrectness. And is that flower truly something that you want to attract other people to, which a lot of people do that are immature? They say, well, I've achieved something. I'm attracting the relevant feelings from other people to be attracted to me because I've got something to say. But what they're gleaning is maybe something they've heard, and having repetitiveness within useful energy, or within making it into a certain dogma if they're older, and they're not really living it. So the main thing is not to contradict yourself in any way whatsoever. And it's very, very difficult to discover a contradiction if you decided that this wisdom that you're imparting is part and parcel of your consciousness, which bore witness to hardship and the span of time that you've gone through to suffer through simple mistakes, or to suffer through the mistakes of other people towards you, so that you can grow with abundance. Because suffering only brings about abundance, feelings of love and care, because you don't want to be you don't want yourself to be treating other people as you've been treated. So it's just like this, I suppose.
Okay, so let me see if I understand it. So, or what I kind of got a glimpse of is that first fruiting could be an immediate impression or assumed understanding that we
Yes.
might run away with and fruit the wrong way. So we want to
Yes.
self-prune and wait until we have the fullness of it, because we don't have all the information.
Yeah, no, it's the same thing as I can look at somebody who's maybe 25, 30, and and see that they're going to make very, very specific mistakes while they're making very, very specific mistakes in terms of their communication. So if I have a devoted student, I'll outline those mistakes and say just withdraw a little bit and wait for yourself to grow beyond what you believe is right until you discover where you're wrong.
Okay.
So when you discover where you're wrong, don't really punish yourself, but you hold back. And a lot of times I say to my students, my very devoted students, I thought I was smart when I was 20 until I got 30. And then when I was 30, I looked back at when I was 20, I thought, oh my God, what was I doing? What was all that? And then when I was 40 and looked back when I was 30, I did exactly the same thing and keep progressing until almost 70. And I go, oh my God. Once I got to 50 and then to 60, I decided, I've got to decide I don't know anything. And then just be propelled to listen to the influx of my own heartfelt inspiration, and listen to this heartfelt inspiration, because it doesn't manifest from me, it manifests from somewhere else. And as I'm listening to what I'm speaking, I've tapped into something quite beautiful. And it's other than myself, even though it is fully myself. So, gleaning insights from people's burnings are one of the most beautiful actions that you can ever portray. It's the only thing worth communicating. Really. And if you can't speak, then you give kindness, and until the kindness is realized. And then when the person begins to understand that they didn't see you and they've been misunderstanding you for 10 or 20 years. I've done this a couple of times with a few people. And then eventually they wake up and realize that they've been accompanied on their journey. And this is not calling myself anything other than what I really am. I'm just a normal human being. But there are mechanisms in the world in terms of when somebody is suffering, that you look at the pathway. They look at the pathway of their life when their life has ended, and when their life was abundant, there were two footsteps on the sand, near the ocean. And when life got hard, then there were only two footsteps. And then when life got better, there were 4 footsteps. And when they died, they said to the Absolute, "This is the most difficult part of my life. Why did you abandon me?" And the Absolute said, "I didn't abandon you. I carried you."
Which I love.
Yeah.
Because we need to know that we are not alone, and sometimes it feels like it. And just because the Absolute appears to be silent, we need to find comfort in that silence and realize what's really going on. So I like that.
Yeah. But so also to sorry, Angel.
No.
There's also something really, really important. I know you want to get to the point. You're very, very motivated and very precise. But is it to recognize the people that come into your life like this, instead of recognizing too late who that person really is. So I believe life is to recognize who is really meant to be in your life, and recognize who's not really meant to be in your life. This is a very, very difficult thing to come to terms with, and you get to the point after many, many years to actually identify straight away the energy which is really meant to be there, instead of not realizing that an energy isn't really meant to be there, is a very, very difficult thing for people to come to terms with. So, the moment I met you, it was like that.
It would be so beautiful if we would be attentive to that, because that could save us from so much headache and heartache.
Yeah, really true, really true.
That's literally nipping it in the bud. So
nipping it. Oh, that's wonderful. Nipping it in the bud. That's perfect.
I like that. So basically the fruiting and the pruning is what of the 8 trees allowed it to grow stronger. Now we're going to deal with the one tree that you allowed to fruit, and it developed an immature seed. So let's look at what happened again, because I love the analogy of what happened between the pit and the flesh, and the wisdom and the immature. I mean, so please.
Yeah. The pit was very, very small, so it was lacking substance, and the flesh was kind of plump, but not really as plump as it could be. But the plumpness of that fruit was sour as well. So when you eat an unripe mango, I don't know whether you know this, I met somebody many, many years ago, I think it was about 45, 50 years ago, and he had no teeth. And I said, what happened to your teeth? And he said, I was fasting I was fasting, and then I ate, to go off the fast, I ate sour mangoes, and he did that for I think it was 2 months, and all of his teeth fell out.
When you said that for the boys and they said, Master, we're going to lose our teeth eating this, I just thought it was hyperbole. I was like,
no, that was a real experience. I mean, the guy was really gummy. And I said, what happened to your teeth? And he says, well, I ate sour mangoes. And I thought, that's interesting.
You would think that after the first hard mango, he would stop.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Okay,
but obviously people go ahead, they believe it's a good thing, and then he loses all his teeth, and then he can't bite down on anything ever again.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought about what we didn't do. I'm getting ahead. When you talked about the immature seed, and once they realized that it was sour, and the flesh, the pit was small, the flesh wasn't representative of what it should have been. It didn't have the taste, It didn't have the flavor, and you have them compost it. And I thought,
you have to compost it. Now when you compost it, you put it under the old mango trees, which are Buddhas sitting there, developing the fruit and the sweetness of that fruit until the heaviness of that wisdom or that sweetness becomes a burden to the branch. The branch gets stronger, opens up the joints, and then more wisdom comes, and then you pick it off, and it's just that way. But when you look at the small pit and you look at the sour fruit, the reason why it's useful, not only for why is it used for composting, is because people usually put this at your feet, and then what can I do with this sour unripened fruit? You give them the wisdom which they thought they had acquired, and when you give them the wisdom that they thought they've acquired with their youthful exuberance, you actually give them back who they are, to humble them. And not only is that a humbling process for the person who is acquiring the wisdom from someone imparting this type of information, it actually humbles and allows the teacher to acquire so much depth because of ignorance. Ignorance is such a beautiful thing when it comes from somebody who's absolutely devoted. But someone who's not devoted, you have to be very, very careful, because they will inadvertently destroy you.
Okay, go back. Ignorance is good for someone who is devoted. I missed something there.
Okay, ignorance, like if someone really wants to say, well, I really want to learn, I really want to break free from my illusions, give the illusions to the teacher. The teacher then imparts certain mechanisms of that illusion, and put a few links of the chain to that to complete the ignorance, and allow them to understand the depth of that ignorance. Not the depth of wisdom, but the depth of how deep that ignorance is, which gives wisdom in terms of communication. So once you begin to understand the depth of your ignorance, then wisdom arrives, because then you can glean that wisdom, because you've gone through the pathway of not knowing what you're doing and pretending you're not knowing what you're doing, to actually really knowing what you're doing in terms of what you're really meant to communicate. And that happens after years and years. If you can speed this up, then everybody is a conduit. And the conduit, anybody who becomes a conduit of spirit, or the conduit of eternity, they usually speak purely from their heart to the person, but it is never scripted. It's always different. So this this is a way to soften the kernel, the immature kernel of somebody else, because if you soften that internal kernel, the kernel will then realize that it's surrounded by its own sourness, and they can compost that as their own wisdom.
I like that. Because that's a different perspective, because I didn't fully understand that analogy. But like the pruning, and something you slipped in, that the pruning would allow for more wisdom to grow. As the stalks come back and you get more foliage, that's going to allow more wisdom. Ignorance is what's being pruned.
Okay, now, sorry, I'm talking over you. I'm so sorry about that. But I'm all excited because I just realized something about what you're saying. Have you ever met a beautiful person that is so vain and they can't see through their vanity, but they're so beautiful and they're locked into their beauty, so to such a degree that they can't get over themselves to actually really see what they're meant to do because their vanity is so strong. You know, so it's like that. The flower is so beautiful. It attracts the bees and people of like-minded, and they go together, and through their vanity, they think that they've discovered something through their vanity, but it's through dropping the vanity and realizing that you don't know anything, that something truly arrives to be truly transmitted, not spoken, truly transmitted. And that transmission, no matter what words you use, as long as it's got the right feeling behind it, it will soften the listener to such a degree that whatever has tethered them will be unlocked, and they'll be freed. And when they're free, they usually flow down with tears. Yeah, that's been my experience.
I like. Thank you. That made more sense. Okay, so we pruned the tree, we tasted it, we realized there was something wrong. 5 years passes, which I thought, wow, that's a whole lot of patiently waiting. So that's a lot of patience. To allow the trees, all of the trees to be ready to bud, and so that the buds become flowers and become fruits. Go ahead.
Yeah, now can I backtrack? You're a very beautiful person. That wasn't spoken toward you.
Oh,
what I just said. Yeah, just to let you know, because I'm not into that.
Right,
I'm not into. So if I realize maybe that you're a very attractive person, no problem. That wasn't spoken to you. I just want to let you know.
Oh, no, I know. I understand that. You know, I'm sitting here as a conduit for everybody else.
Yeah. Okay. Great.
And I'm okay with that. I'm okay with that. I mean, so let's see. So now the trees are ready. We're into the patiently waiting chapter where all the trees are now ready. And the young disciples wanted to know, why was the fruits that was separated so sour, which we've already discussed. But you made a comment in that chapter that the boys were like the plants, but they didn't realize the abundance within them, because we're transitioning into the abundance chapter. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Okay, the abundance. The reason that the 9 disciples were abundant is because they gave. I instructed them in the book to actually be kind and to be open, but not to advise anybody in the village. To hold back what they realize and what they could speak to in terms of what they're realizing, is hold that back until their kindness has a deep recognition by the community that they don't need to say anything, because the kindness will bring about a certain frequency which will allow the people that are much older than them to appreciate them. And once they're appreciated, they've achieved what they couldn't achieve if they were to give advice to someone who's 20 years older, which is usually rejected.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because like, where does that come from? So that's, kind of letting your own fruits walk before you and let them recognize and see you for your fruits. So by being silent and giving that love, like you said, then they're open to receive. And then they solicit why.
Say that again. Sorry.
And then the older person, they solicit why, as opposed to offering unsolicited advice, which is never received.
Well, you see that when you're in a community like that, it's there's usually a lot of impoverishment in communities like this. So the mango grove was designed to give a certain amount of abundance, sweetness, and the trees themselves would feed the villagers when they were starving. So the appreciation of being fed, the sweet fruit bring about joy. And anybody that has any sense will know that the pre-programming of someone who's really hungry and who's really appreciates something given to them without anything expected in exchange becomes as sweet as the fruit given. And selfishness, there should be no selfishness in our society. Once someone gleans the fact that a young person that's very, very powerful physically because they've had their hands and feet their feet on soil, their hands in dirt, caring for something which transmits information to them without words, and you do exactly the same thing. You transmit to the people that you give to without words, and it's exactly the same transmission that they get from the old trees. And it's exactly what we're missing as a humanity. How do we listen to what we can't hear because we really can't hear it anymore? You'll notice that people who work on the land, they're very, very blunt, very to the point. They've got nothing much to say. And if you show loyalty and goodness towards them, they'll be loyal to you for the rest of their life. Because one drop of goodness in a man's or a woman's life that works themselves to the bone is appreciated by somebody who shows kindness, can understand what they've gone through. Because as a country person, you can't say, well, I'm not going to work today because the land is unforgiving, and that unforgiving land it builds character. So when these people character is they're doing the best they can, and then they find themselves a little bit short on food, then this is appreciated deeply because the boys are doing exactly the same thing. They're working endlessly without expecting anything in exchange, and they had to do that when they gave the fruit to the general villagers, not to expect anything in exchange, but to allow the sweetness of that fruit to come back as appreciation and devotion towards the devotion and appreciation of those boys, because they were under the tutelage of a very loving teacher.
I'm making notes. 1 second. Okay. Because I'm that's into the abundance, which we're getting there. So I'll revisit that. That's why I wanted to make a note. You spoke about, when you were talking about in the patiently waiting chapter, you talked about prayer and the acoustic phenomenon that the mango was to the soul. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, I kind of just did, but it's like,
well, the acoustic phenomenon part, because
the acoustic
and the holographic spoke.
Yeah, the holographic spokes obviously are very permeable. And the permeability of an open person is exactly like this. They're extremely permeable. And if they have any hardness within them or something unresolved, it will hit that unresolved spot. So when we were talking in the previous interview, if someone practices anger and then slowly cuts off the need to be angry until they're empty of the impulse to be angry, then the permeability of a frequency which comes towards them, they'll know the anger comes from somebody else, not from them, because they've dealt with this trigger point within inside of themselves. And a lot of people say, well, how do I deal with that if I don't get angry and don't protect myself? I said, bleed from the center of your chest and learn from the wound, but don't wound somebody else because it's inappropriate. But as in terms of the frequency, we're subject to frequency all the time. So I can use an example in terms of the openness of animals, because I don't know how I will explain it, only with Samadhi, which is my cat, my ragdoll cat. Now, she's loved and cherished, and there are certain things we will do and certain things we won't do with her, in terms of building or imprinting on her. And she's really imprinted on us. We love her so deeply, and that's just the consequence of us being loving human beings. But now, when she would she'd come jump on the bed and she would meow loudly. And Miss Pacific, we've got to ignore her to break this repetitive thing of wanting to wake us up at 4 o'clock in the morning, which she started again actually the last 2 days. But instead of meowing after we got her out of that routine, she would meow in the middle of my head so loudly, like it was like she was literally inside of my head meowing, and I felt an enormous amount of gratitude, because she trusts me enough to transmit her voice inside my head to show me that she was she was capable of transmitting her call to my head. And it happened 3 times in a row before she arrived she jumps on the bed and she usually comes up and goes like this. Meow. But she did it before she arrived. And then when she arrived, she stood and looked at me and did exactly the same meow. But the meow inside my head was like thunderous. And it happened 3 times in a row. And I appreciated that because I was open enough at that particular point because I was in a semi-sleeping state. Because even though I'm sleeping, I'm still awake. I'm very, very unusual. And when and that's not putting tickets on myself either, but because I was open enough to hear her, can I hear her when I'm fully awake? And those mechanisms of subtleties have just gone a little bit deeper than what they are when you're sleeping. So it was a very, very beautiful thing to get the transmission of her communication before she arrived, which she was warning me she was coming. And there were so many messages within the frequency of her communication. I got it straight away, because the frequency then is retranslated by the heart to understand immediately what the transmission is. There is no confusion when it comes to this. So if I see, just say, a rattlesnake, the rattlesnake will indicate to me a frequency. There are big boundaries around me. Don't come, I'm dangerous, and I recognize that immediately. So there are certain rules and regulations within our environment that we have to respect and uphold. Otherwise, we put ourselves into danger, and that's why we've got so much contradictory elements within our world as dangerous towards us as human beings. But we're being taught that there are boundaries that we're overstepping, and when we overstep those boundaries, we can get harmed if we don't really listen to what the world is communicating with us, and we've lost our way quite tremendously when it comes to this. So it's so when you realize this, to be caregivers of this planet, we have to realize where the boundaries are. And as soon as we see the boundaries, there are boundaries, then the boundaries are dropped. And then there's no harm done to the person in terms of those boundaries, because we've grown to the point where we understand the boundaries. Then the species that gave you the boundaries drops the boundaries.
Once the message is received.
Yeah, but we haven't received the message. That's why there's so many dangers for us.
So if we stop and listen, that should eliminate some of the dangers.
As a collective manifestation of a humanity, not yet, because there are too many people still making the mistakes, and the cultivation of our mistakes has been made habitual in terms of the being emotionally pre-programmed to be in a state of fear is not conducive to being open and compassionate. And that's happened to us. That's happened to the whole world over the last 4 years, actually. Put into an emotional psychotic state, and people's psychosis then hides their true nature. And that's and as far as human beings, we haven't even learned to treat each other with respect yet, and let alone the world itself is dying all around us in terms of I would say a great there are many species which are not going to exist because we can't hear them. They're dying right in front of us. So if something is becoming depleted in front of us, it's because we've misused the world, but we've depleted the world of our true capacity to communicate with what we've been given responsibility for.
So if we're in tune with the acoustic phenomenon, let me make sure I understand, then basically that's going to be us recognizing the source of the impression that's coming to us, that yes. frequency, that communion, and that's what's going to resonate and then take us into the knowing, the being and not doing what's the right action in that moment.
Yes, but that's a very, very long, it's a very, very long and arduous path, and very narrow. Narrow in the way that there are many things that you cannot indulge in, and if we can learn that that we're given the full width and breadth to indulge in anything these days, have we lost our way because of this? We are not gaining more freedom and more fluidity. What we're doing is gaining less fluidity and less wisdom, because we've been given permission to be something other than what we are. And it's being incrementally done since the 1950s quite strongly. And the result is that we've got young people growing that are very dependent, very sensitive, and can't grow beyond the infantile feelings that they assume is their wisdom, instead of their strength to combat the burdens of what's really in front of them. You've got to get out there and you've got to fight for your right to actually become who you're really meant to be, without being destructive when you discover that you're being destroyed by that very environment, our human environment. So it's really important to be humbled by our world, but it's very, very bad for our leaders to actually give us permission to be less than what we are, so that we don't stand up for our rights in a very, very strange way at the moment. Very strange way.
Right to become who you are.
Yeah, the right to become who you are, but not the right to become something you're not meant to be. That's what's happening at the moment. Everyone's been given the right to be something they're not meant to be, and they're pre-programmed. This is a big subject. We've gone off the power of emptiness, quite frankly. We'll keep going where you were.
No, we were doing good with the acoustic phenomenon and where that was taking us. But if you wanted to come back, I wanted to deal with what you said about the prayer as transmission, that we're not actually praying the prayer, but is it our soul's bidding? Or could you elaborate on that? Prayer as a transmission.
Okay. The prayer is my steadfast nature, in terms of, if I wish you good, then I am fully capable of wishing myself this, and I would not wish you anything other than I wish myself. But the wish itself is not a word. It's not a thought. I've already arrived upon that. So then my prayer is manifesting within my body, and then the manifestation of that very, very delicate wisdom is that I wish you success, without anything other than wishing you success, and wishing that you have success right at the moment that it's wished, not futuristically, not anything but it's complete, because the feeling is complete. I wish you success, but I don't say I wish you success. I'm there wishing you for success, and the person will realize it and then become abundantly strong to know that they can be successful. And it may be 1,000 no's that they have to go through to find the appropriate yes of their life. So, but to come to terms with the battle of all those no's, they have to have somebody that says, go, I'm there, I'm here for you. And no matter how many people say no, I believe in you.
Okay, that makes more sense. So then that becomes a communion that is just dynamic, always.
A dynamic communion, because to give a negative, is the world is going to do that anyway, but to give people the strength to move through that negative is the most precious gift you can give to someone. So don't worry, it doesn't matter how many times this is going to happen, there'll be a time when it stops. And wait patiently for when that stops, because that's when grace comes upon your path within your life. And then you realize, okay, now it's time. But until it's time, you patiently wait for that time to occur. And I can attest this in my own life. Yeah, to patiently wait for the right people to come and appear, and they will come and appear at such a speed and at such an abundance when time is correct and right.
That was such an excellent ending to the patiently waiting, and right into our abundance chapter.
Yeah.
You're tying it all together, which is great. So I wanted to talk about, when you get to the abundance chapter, you talk about the young people of the village appreciating all that the trees in the mango grove has given them. This is when the master comes in and they said, okay, we're ready for you to reveal this other knowledge that you had us wait for another gazillion years. No.
And he said, not in 5 years.
Yeah, exactly. It was longer than 5 years. I think it was down to year 11 or whatever it was. I was like, that's a lot of waiting. But he wanted to come and talk to them about how the village had grown and the mango grove is no longer supporting the village. So we need to convince the trees to give more abundance. And they're stuck on waiting for that revelation, didn't even hear what he said. And so now we're talking about, okay, there's a need there. The need is for more abundance. We've had abundance, we appreciate it, but now we need more. How are we going to coax these trees for more abundance? And I thought it was interesting that it seems so counterintuitive to injure a tree, to coax it, and you're saying we're asking it for more food.
Okay,
asking it, you're beating it. No.
Yeah, you cut it gently like this, and the tree's immunity will get stronger because it's under attack. So that's why I asked the young apprentices to wear a small machete, which gives the indication of danger, but no, there's no danger there, because that's what these particular implements in previous times were used to as a shield, but also protection. And the other person that you're not in conflict with will see the knife, and their immunity will be strengthened because they can see the knife, but there's no threat from the person. So it's exactly the same if I teach iron palm to somebody, soft iron palm. I say, beat your arms. And they said, why beat your arms? And I said, it's called the wolf syndrome. The wolf syndrome is that if I put pressure on my bones like this, and the pressure of my bones, it opens my bones up when I put the pressure on it, and when I release the pressure, the bones close again. So it's like a plait. So the pesal energy is exactly the same as the wolf syndrome, because when you put pressure on the bones, it opens it up and then closes open it, and then the bones stay green and you stay younger longer. In terms of your flexibility of the because they're like coat hangers. Our bones our flesh hangs off it. We're upright because of our bones. We've got to keep our bones healthy. So the wolf syndrome is basically what happens to you. Just a personal question: what happens to you when someone puts you under duress? When you put under duress, you go through all the mechanisms for why you're going to be offended, until you grow past that, and that person's out of your life. You look back and you go, okay, they weren't managing their life properly. They made me suffer, but I can see that they were limited. You forgive them immediately after that particular point. But because you were put under so much duress, if you don't become resentful, you become abundantly wise, because you know that you're not going to become that person. You're only going to give the results from your environment back to your environment in terms of your abundant feelings, because of the amount of suffering you went through. Now, when this is traditionally done, and I learned about this when I was in Bali, is that the guys would just chop the part of the mango tree. That's where I learned that, and then the mango tree would be more abundant because it's under threat, because it doesn't want to be cut down. So the tree knows very well. Trees communicate too. They have a very, very refined language, and this is very, very brutal. But isn't life brutal to those who are bearing fruit, and they need to bear more fruit? So they meet difficult people to become tethered to this particular person, until they realize the wisdom that they've delivered to them through the duress that's been given to them. And this is usually what occurs if you learn to forgive, if you learn to know that it wasn't necessary, but it doesn't really matter. It happened. So then you gain from being attacked. You gain wisdom from not indulging in attacking back, because it's all about it's about everything else other than reflecting back the meanness of a person. You reflect back to them who you are, even if you can't speak to them. So once you get past the stage of rebelling and then soundboarding them back to them in a like fashion, you don't soundboard back to them. You forgive them because you can't turn yourself into that person in any way whatsoever. Otherwise, you lost your path. You've lost everything at that particular point. Have I gone off into a tangent?
No, this is wonderful, because what you did is you slipped in a caveat to the growth. So we're subject to the imposition of the stress, but you said that the growth comes if we're not resentful of and so you kind of slipped that in. So I wanted to make a note of that, because it's not just that I was subjected to it and I survived, but the strength will come with the mindset and the attitude of not being resentful for the lesson,
Yeah, you know, when if somebody comes up to you and they hit you in the heart and they've really injured you because they don't really understand what they're doing, it's your this is my experience. It's probably been your experience. It's been everybody's. It goes bang, and you, oh, that's an injury. The person didn't really understand what they were doing. They're quite blind to their impact. But maybe they're doing it on purpose because they've trained themselves to believe that impact is some control issue that they haven't overcome, or their maturity is at say maybe 10 or 13 or 14 years old, and they haven't gone beyond that emotional immaturity, so they're still hurting people without knowing that that their actions are reprehensible until they learn from somebody that just watches very, very gently. I've done this with somebody that's been quite mean over the last 4 years. And I keep forgiving them until I got to the point that that they began to realize that there was something that needed to be altered within them because I wasn't attacking them back. I got injured and then saw that injury, and know that if I respond in the most inappropriate way, I've actually entangled myself with that energy. Do I want to promote the entanglement of that energy, or am I going to just, should I weep, which I did a couple of times? Should I weep about this person? Yes, I did, because I needed to release my heart, because weeping is better than resentment, because resentment is a very, very destructive force. So simply just crying is a way to relieve yourself of a pressure that is openly available to you. But a lot of people will say, well, you've got to be stronger and wiser, Lujan. No. I'm not in a monastery. I'm not protected. I'm in the world, and the only way to cope with this is to really look at how you're bleeding, and if it's repetitive, then it's going to rise and show you who you are through your tears. And if you don't have tears, it'll show you who you are with the resentment. Which one do you want?
Definitely not the resentment. That hurts more.
Yeah, that hurts more. Yeah. So so when I mean, geez. And tears without emotion are very, very cleansing. Tears without emotion. To release your pressure of your body through your eyes is really what you're meant to do, because you receive those people through the listening capacity of your eyes to hit your heart immediately. So your eyes will release you from the burden in a very, very specific way. If you cry with resentment and with a background, I'm going to get you later on, those tears will have neurotransmitters, which mean no change is occurring, and this has scientifically been proven. Yeah, so it's very, very interesting when they come about these types of things through the ways and the means that they can check the neurotransmitters in tears. Yeah,
that's interesting, because that means that you've got to set your attention on, what am I doing? What am I? What's the purpose of this cry? Is it an angry cry because I'm going to muster all my strength to get you back, or is it a releasing cry? You know, because there are those cries, but it's more of a releasing cry. You know, when I'm in that mood, I like to sit and listen to a thunderstorm soundtrack, and like I'm sitting in the midst of the thunderstorm and it's just washing it away. And I mean, that helps me, but because the angry cry, not so helpful.
Yeah. Yeah, you could say, well, the meanest people have done the most profound thing to you, as long as you don't become a mirror image of that mean person. Because if I look back at people who've been really mean to me, I could transform myself into projecting towards that person in the same vein that I'm capable of doing, which I refuse to do, because this is not really healthy. So those mean people just should teach us not to be like them, because we realize we're not like. Have you got up to the chapter Misplaced Memories?
No, that's in our next interview.
Yeah, okay, we'll go there then. But yeah, so it's very, very important to discover your original nature, and within young people, their original nature is very, very strong, as long as they haven't been pre-programmed not to be in a state of communion, because because when we're young, to be in a state of communion is extremely important. And what's happened to our young people these days is they've got their face in a phone or a face in the computer, and they're communicating with a frequency which has got nothing to do with human contact. This is very dangerous for our species.
Because they don't know what they're really letting in.
Yeah, they don't know what they're letting in, and they're formulating communication with something which isn't real right in front of them. And you'll see most people when they're out, they're all looking down like this instead of communicating with each other. You know, it's dangerous, and I think I really believe the companies know what they're doing, because they've entrapped, you know, the representations of salesmanship to actually make sure people go down a certain track to benefit the financial abundance of our world, which is not looking for the abundance of the people in this world.
No, it's not.
Yeah,
and that's a whole nother topic. We can get into
that's
that.
A whole nother topic.
I know that they've been programming subliminally how we feel about ourselves, our self-worth and our value, and hey, we've got this and that, and it's so easy to buy into it when you're getting it from so many different angles in the media. So yes.
Yeah.
I wanted to maybe.
Yes.
Okay. I wanted to talk a little bit about, as we're transitioning into your introduction of your teacher or the teacher, how the stress induces more fruit. Now, first, on the first fruiting, as I was doing my research, it said that the cold temperature will initially, a lot of times, spark a fruiting. And I thought, cold temperature. Then another natural stressor is drought. Those will spark. And under that type of natural duress, the mango tree wants to self-propagate. So it pushes more fruit. And I thought, okay, that makes logical sense. And then we look at the unnatural stressors, like the slashing of the tree. And I looked up to see if it was still done today, because I thought it was so rudimentary. It had to have gone out of style. And there were videos of people with hammers still hammering the trees. Still doing it. And I thought, wow, they're still doing that. There's something. How did you discover that by accident? But yeah, they're still doing it. So we've got that. They will also add salt to the soil, smoke the tree, or intentionally withhold water. All of these seem very cruel, but the whole motive is to bring forth more abundance and more fruit and sweeter fruit. And
that's why the mango tree is called the king of fruit, because it's the same as Buddha. Is that Buddha is continually put under duress, and he's always fruiting, always giving, no matter what comes.
I like that.
Yeah. So this is the reasoning behind it in terms of the wisdom of mistreatment. Everybody's had the experience where they go to be kind to someone and they get attacked. And if they don't attack back, they realize that they overstepped. So they draw themselves back and wait for the most appropriate time to do it. And what we've got to learn is what is the most appropriate time to speak and what is the most appropriate time not to speak. Not speaking and withholding is a very, very beautiful state to be in, because nobody knows you're watching them. Nobody knows you're growing through what they're giving to you in terms of their behavioral patterns and where they're located, without judging them. This is a very, very beautiful thing, because you can be kind to that person, because if you see them through their delivery, you can see where they're limited, where they're not getting enough love, where they're not getting enough understanding, and then you stand in front of this person and you give them understanding, you give them love. And I've got a neighbor down 4 doors down, and she's been going through many different things, and she's responding to just the kind gestures, and responding, believing that she's understood, because she is understood. And then one day she said inside of her head, I need a hug, and I gave her a hug. She said, how did you know? I said, because you wanted it. And then I went to the post box, got my mail, and said goodbye to her and everything like this. And there are no agendas. It's just a natural reflex. Now, when I gave her a hug, I didn't know she wanted a hug, but when This is the 50% equation that we have to be very, very diligent to be aware of, that the 50% equation of what you do in comparison to you didn't know why you did it is the propagation of a form of wisdom which comes upon you without you knowing it's even there, and you act upon it. And if you can be wise enough to act upon these particular impulses, not knowing why, then the person will inadvertently give you the truth. How did you know it? And you say, well, I didn't know. I'm humbled by this. And this is the God consciousness inside of you, telling you what the need is for the other person, without you knowing that need was really there. And if you give substance to that need, you become a conduit of the unknown quality of that very, very preciousness descending inside of you, and then putting you in a state of ascension where you can actually respond, but not knowing why. So you become I don't know what they call that. Freeze frame. But anyway, I don't know what it's called. But you become a conduit of that state of awareness, a conduit or an open vessel for that. But you never know you're an open vessel. If you think you're an open vessel, there's a lot of danger. It's only when the open vessel allows you to realize you didn't know that you were open and that it was occurring, that humbles you and gives you the most important lesson of life, is that I don't know why, but it's occurring. And I'm blessed because I've been given the words of the truth from that person toward my capacity not even to know why I did it. So it's moving through me, yet it moves through the honest communication of that person. How did you know I wanted a hug? So it enters both people at that particular point, but it's only revealed by the person that is not threatened by the fact that you did it when they said it without words. So it's a form of transmission, the same way the cat. But the cat got inside of my head and went meow like this, and I thought, oh, that's really beautiful, Samadhi. But as another person gets inside of you, there's a test. There is a test. And this test is, can I respond? I say I'm Tourette's because I respond without not knowing why I'm doing it, and then I discover that I did it for the best reasons that could be done, because the person was honest enough to tell me and humble enough to ask, how did you know? And I say I didn't, and then I would say, why are you so honest with me? And then we're propagating something which is unseen together, and this communal affair has to expand into a whole community, so we can be looking after each other in the most appropriate manner, without any motives, without any intentions, but to let this subtlety run through us, so that we can truly be a true neighbor to a neighbor.
And that kind of goes back to your who am I and your dialogue with your friend, and always him asking, how did you know I needed that? How did you know I needed this? How did you know? He knew about you, right?
Yeah, that was Suma. Suma was a very, 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 very beautiful and very, very tricky Balinese guy. He was so sweet. He was 11 years younger than me, and he said, I'm 11 years older. I'm your bigger brother. And I said, okay. He used to call me the scientist, because he would say, well, Lujan, the scientist, works out everything before we know it, So it's so whenever he needed the turmeric, I knew, because he would send me the transmission. He would say, well, I need turmeric. I would go and get the turmeric, because he had a lot of pain in his body. I would give him the turmeric, and he said, how did you know I ran out? And I said, you know how, Suma, you sent me the message.
Yeah.
And over and over
beautiful.
Again. Yeah.
And that's beautiful.
And this was a very, very interesting. So sorry if I'm going off target.
You're fine.
Yeah, you're very diligently on point. But he was blind in his right eye, and I said, look, I want to pay for the surgery for your eye, because I know that it must be very terrible for you, because I used to see his Balinese friends joking on his blind side. I thought, ooh, this is really mean. And then when he would look around, then they would pretend that it was okay. It was very devious. I didn't like it, but I paid for it. And he said, oh, I got the flu. I'm going to take a few days off. And it took him a week. He had his eye covered. And then he said, don't tell anyone, I can see out of my right eye. And then he saw what they were doing out of the eye, which they thought he was blind.
Did he just not know?
No, he suspected it, but
But to
Balinese
see
people
it
are
is a
very,
whole
very,
different, yeah.
oh, to see it is a whole different thing. When I saw him see this, it adhered to him. It adhered to me in a way of brotherly love that I've never seen before, and he called to me when he died. You know, he called to me, and it was very, very strong. Yeah, because he was cleaning black mold, and then he went to the hospital. He was all congested, and they gave him antibiotics, which killed him.
Oh, geez. Yeah.
And you know, I loved him very, very dearly. He was such a mischievous, lovely, lovely guy. You know, but he was the most. He was probably the first person I ever loved deeply that had died, and it hit me very, very hard. So here's like just to honor his name. Yeah, he was very special to me. But you know, we were very. I used to sneak sandwiches into my clothing like this because all the other Balinese would get jealous, and I would take a pork sandwich to him, and he'd be laughing, just sneak it in.
I like that.
And yeah, he was
I like
a beautiful
that.
guy.
And feeding the cat.
Yeah, and feeding the cat. Yeah,
I like that.
Go ahead. Yeah.
So this is good. So the 50% equation, which we're going to revisit later on having had the story and what we're going to do later on in our interviews. But when we kind of wrapping up the pruning and how I guess the takeaway is how can we view life stressors as welcome catalysts? Because it seemed a little sadistic at first that I should be happy for this, but to find out the beauty of it, as you were saying, and welcome the stressors.
Yeah. But you know that the pruning is exactly the same principle as the 50% equation, because I was pruned at that particular point, because I responded without knowing why I responded, and then she gave me the truth, and then I knew the truth of my actions were good and wholesome. But if I assumed anything other than just being humble enough just to do it without I just responded. Like I said, this is exactly the same. You're being pruned by something that's quite large, and to know that you've acted appropriately, and then to find out that appropriateness was in the value of their desire to be comforted by me, then I realized, okay, I didn't know I was comforting that person, but they were honest enough to tell me that they were in need at that particular post. That's how I was pruned. Even at this age, I'm still being pruned.
But you got an immediate response from that pruning. That pruning yielded immediate fruit that you were able to.
Because I didn't say, "Oh, how good I am." I didn't say immediately, "Well, I knew you wanted that." So many people lie in this circumstance. They did not. They just want to look better than what they are. They don't know to prune. But it's very valuable to be pruned all the time. It's very, very valuable to consider yourself open to an exchange which may change your perspective. If you're not open, how can you change your perspective?
Right.
So then the flower of wisdom is spinning, and it's looking at you. Are you ready for this?
That's that lotus petal we talked about. So I got that flower of wisdom. All right. Last chapter for this interview, introducing teacher. Okay. You had mentioned before about the machete, and I wanted to talk a little bit more about the gift of the machete, because you had an interesting take on it. These were some of my takeaways, and I want to elaborate on them. First of all, I found out that the machete was considered a sacred object. I said, "Oh, really? Not a cross, not, a machete." And I liked that you made the statement that wearing the knife makes the body feel strong and secure. You just kind of know you're there. That it represents protection and readiness to act in any situation. Makes me want to go get a machete. It shows strength and reveals a threat even in the absence of conflict. I thought that was interesting because they, like you said, the people would wear them on their waist, but not even realize that the subliminal messages that are going on here. And that it's an ancient form of power, not dominance. We need to talk about that power versus dominance. And that it ultimately allows the immunity to become stronger. That's a whole lot in a machete. So please.
Well, it's exactly the same as wearing a rudraksha or wearing my wedding ring over my heart. you take something that you believe is sacred and you wear it and it disappears on your body. Once it disappears on your body, you integrate it because you don't know it's there anymore. So in the ancient times, they were wearing these weapons, but those weapons weren't inappropriate. They would disappear because they become part of their garment. But if they don't disappear and become part of the garment, then the person is truly a threat. And those people actually cut themselves before they even make the threat of cutting somebody else. This is the inappropriate use of a knife. Yeah.
Okay.
But then you've got to reverse engineer that into the appropriateness and inappropriateness of consciousness in terms of its cutting edge. It's a double-edged sword.
Wait a minute, I got to write that down. I like that.
Yeah.
Okay. Go ahead.
I don't know what else to say. I'm just observing your beautiful nature, really.
Well, because I like that inappropriate use of consciousness, and we'll end up injuring ourselves. I mean, that's beautiful. That goes back to, not having too much fertilizer that may damage us if we encounter things. If you wield that tool before you're ready or have the aptitude, you're going to injure yourself. So that goes back into the not doing and waiting and the just being still.
Oh my God, your discernment is beyond belief. That's
why I'm like, I gotta make a note of that. That's some good stuff.
What the this is superb. The way that you're rearranging things, it's very beautiful.
My mind is not cataloging and it's an associating machine. I'm like, how does that relate to this? So wow. So the machete, that's powerful, and you kind of didn't give it a whole lot of time, but it was just a powerful tool of understanding.
Yeah. Now, my machete is my whole body. I've trained as a martial artist for many, many years, so I would never use that inappropriately. So nobody sees the sword on my waist because it's hidden within the humbleness of my approach. And that's why a lot of people believe that they can be mean, but they don't really understand the danger they could be in. But I would never use it. It's only meant to be used if someone comes through my door inappropriately, want to hurt my wife. Then I would use it without anger. It would be just a tool of survival, not a tool of revenge, or the wrong tool.
So since I'm not a martial artist and I'm not chopping mango groves, what can we have as a machete in this modern day to
your intellect? Your intellect is very sharp. Your intellect is superbly sharp. So there's your double-edged sword. And it's a wonder to watch in terms of how you appropriate information from what I gave you, how you glean something which is totally opposite. This is the right use of the intellect, because the intellect then becomes true wisdom if you use your intellect in a way to transmute an understanding from one degree to another degree, and then that degree can maybe be absorbed. And that's exactly that's your intention, is to simplify my teachings so that it can be absorbed by more people. So your intellect is an act of devotion at this particular point. You're not using it against yourself, you're not using it against my teachings or anything like this. You're using it so appropriately. So there's your weaponry, and it's sheathed. It's your expression is basically as it is. It is transforming one wisdom to another type of discernible wisdom, and then that will fall into people's hearts, and it's falling into your heart as you're realizing, making a differentiation between the two, and then landing where your understanding abides at that particular point by using two viewpoints. And in the middle of that is your heart. Your heart assumes that information in terms of its complexity of absorption, and then the expression of that absorption in a way which voices your being. This is the appropriateness of the mind, and then the mind becomes adhered to the heart after that. But if the mind is used, if the mind is used for dominance, it can never adhere to the principle of the heart, which is the true mind. And the true mind has only got maybe 46,000 neurotransmitters in comparison to the head, but the head's not meant to speak. Our heart is. So So if we've got billions of neurotransmitters here that are automated, we've been given only a few thousand neurotransmitters in the heart, and with the limitation of those neurotransmitters, we must learn to speak from there and not from here.
You said the limitation of the neurotransmitters, limitation in that it's not running programmed loops, or
no, it's not running programmed loops. It's limited. The mind is not limited. The mind is kind of competitive. The heart isn't competitive, but if you find yourself competitive, you're not in your heart, you're in your liver. So it's, there are various frequencies inside the body, but the heart's not competitive. It will just glean a truth and tell the truth to another heart, where the mind will have a debate, and the true debate will drop. The true debate between people will drop you into your heart, because then you'll realize that you won, but you lost because you won.
Then what I found with doing that is there's been a whole lot of, as I've been trying to unplug and undo what I would normally do, the thought processes, the actions, etc. There's like a feeling of, yes, I've won, but it kind of hurts to let go of that ego a little bit. So I kind of feel it and breathe through it. And it's like, I recognize the change, but it's like, whew, okay, I'm letting go of that, who I was or who I've become.
I would say that you've appropriated your original nature, but you're a little bit too hard on yourself, really, in terms of, you have to honor the innate intelligence which has propelled you into the person that you were and you're becoming, because who you were is part and parcel of who you are right now. Right. And I appreciate your elasticity in terms of the fluidity of your mind, but also the content of your heart to recognize that there's something other than the mind is basically, it's a beautiful thing. So your strength can be your weakness, but your strength isn't your weakness. It's actually propelled you into it to find out how you can be stronger via that strength, but never let go of the original strength that brought you to the position where you are, because I'm finding this, our communication is quite valuable in terms of, I never saw it that way. So you understand? So I appreciate your strengths and your abilities in comparison to this girl, this woman is giving me, I'm looking through this lens and I thought, well, that's just beautiful, so it's so then your strengths will be appreciated and maybe blah blah blah.
Yep, different angle of the kaleidoscope. So
yeah.
Okay, so we're going to wrap up the teacher chapter. Right in the last minute or so of the Audible chapter, there were some admonitions that I would just like to kind of end with that really kind of stuck with me. So one thing we've gone over already is that these teachers' admonitions prior to continuing with our pathway down the memory is to recognize what can be known via our acoustic revelation as the prayer of the body to the transdimensional being that is traveling within it. So we went over that. That makes more sense now. You admonish to allow the rivers of the mind to flow through the body and recognize the resistances from external phenomena and challenges from the environment that wish to provoke us into knowing, which must immediately transform into a not doing, so as not to be caught up into the illusion presenting itself to be the guise of somebody else's circumstances. So we kind of went over that kind of as a recap, and to be secured in that neutral stance, as that neutrality will help transform the dogma that's held in the body consciousness.
Yes. It's the transdimensional, how many billions of years old or millions of years old is the transdimensional being within us? If we can glean certain aspects of previous lifetimes, and I mean just glean, you can't perfectly know. You can only be given the heartfelt feeling of a process, because that's the only way you can remember this. So the transdimensional being is wishing to communicate everything that it's gone through in terms of all the suffering to get to this particular point. And then when the suffering it becomes totally intolerable and we're almost at the end of our tether, we're given messages. from our past to for the revelations of what this transdimensional being has gone through in terms of its journey. And it's an indication that the journey is almost at its end, because you can remember where you were and who you were. And the only things you can remember in terms of where you were and who you were is not remembering war or remembering tragedies. It's remembering the love and the devotion you had for another human being. This is the only way you can remember past lives. You don't remember past lives through violence, because that violence itself will propel you back into another repetition of that. It's the repetition of love and kindness and understanding that we must reduce ourselves to a certain degree to remember those boons, those particular delicate and most beautiful items that were made available for us, and we've forgotten it. They all come back as a flood. And I can attest it because it's happened to me. I remember my past lives with so much beauty, not with anything else. And also too, if you read The Power of Emptiness, where I go back and to a disciple of mine, it's only through the devotion and through the love between two people that gave me the capacity to go back and as a mist and say I've arrived. And this was hundreds of years later, while my devotion, while my devotee was over my body. This was in Tibet. So to remember the person who was there, that he was guarding until he got the message that I landed safely, which was maybe only 3 or 4 days for him, but was hundreds of years until I got into the next position. And to go back and to remember that is an amazing thing, and to actually know who that person was that he was being devoted to was a very, very precious thing. It wasn't Lujan Matus, it was someone else.
That was so rewarding to hear about that, the hope and the way that the lifetimes were not sequential, but the way you were able to loop that in a different way. It's like we're living this way, but that just kind of tapped in. And that was beautiful. It was nice to know that love is what triggered the connection.
And also to the, if you're in a futuristic timeline and you come back, you won't meet yourself. But the futuristic timeline, if you have a futuristic time and you want to come back, you only have to come back to stop something occurring which could be very damaging for our species. And I spoke about this in Shadows in the Twilight.
So when you talk about the incarnation you had in 25 something, the reason for that was to make a change now? Or to integrate some of the wisdom now?
Everybody's making a change, but it's but this is a very difficult subject to go on. Maybe we'll go into that subject later on, because we can. Yeah, because we don't really understand that future and past and present moment, they don't really exist, but because we divide things into these areas of limitation, we can travel within those limitations. Yeah, and we will have the technology, we do have the technology now actually, but we will have it available for the underground military in 500 years to come back and make the changes so that we can alter the direction of our future, because our species is in danger at the moment. Anyway, blah, blah, blah. Won't go into that subject.
I like that, because we talk about the, anyway, we can go somewhere else. So the last admonition, just before we end this chapter, before we go into the other one, I'm going to just make this wonderful kind of sum up in that my teacher chapter, and ask you to reflect on it, and then we can continue with the next one. But you said, concentrate with sincerity toward all beings of light to develop a level of devotion to never do harm to another. And I thought that was a nice way to kind of end that.
Yeah, all beings of light, every being, no matter what. This is our challenge: is to be kind, to be open to someone who's not kind and open. We have to change the general mass frequency of our world into another frequency that is supportive for our growth, as very, very mysterious beings. We're not like we think. We're not cattle, we're not flesh and blood. We're something else very, very special. But if we see ourselves as something special, then we won't make it. We've got to reduce ourselves to what we've been subject to, because we're lost, and we have to come to terms with it. And the first thing to do is to endeavor not to hurt anybody. And everybody knows that a lot of people in everybody's life are hurt because they don't understand. And it's a big dilemma in our societal ebbs and flows, that if our communication was truly open, there wouldn't be a generational gap between people. There would be, oh, I understand. Because I understand, without formulating, how can I understand this? It's a bodily experience. And once this occurs, then there'll be no generational gap, and then our species would have elevated themselves beyond the limitations of a generational gap. It shouldn't be there. It shouldn't be there. And that, when you hold a child, it looks at you and it knows it's protected until it's not protected, and then it changes. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, so this type of transmission is squished very early. And also the child will test you. It'll pee, it'll poo its pants, it'll cry, keep you up at night and everything like that. The test is on for everybody.
To say, do you still love me now?
Yes, do you still love me now? Ooh, that's happy.
This is great. Well, those are the few chapters I wanted to handle this time. And so we will start with the continuation of the story of your teacher, because there's some good stuff in there I'm looking forward to. So thank you so much. I got great understandings, and I'll continue to try and tune into, to the collective to find out what everybody else wants, so I can be a conduit to that. And I look forward to the next interview. Okay. Thank you so much for being here, Angel. I really appreciate you very, very deeply. Thank you. I'm having fun. Okay. Bye, lovely. Bye-bye.